I'll tell you what, that dang old internet, man, you just go on there and point and click, get in there and talk about www. Call me, you got then.
For some reason or another, you sound a little taller on radio.
Well, for my money, he's got all the facial characteristics of a criminal.
Now, here's your host, that gravy-sopping, crappie-flopping, stump-jumping, Bible-thumping, gun-toting, mater-growing son of a gun, the Backwoods Baptist himself, Pastor Harold Smith.
Thank you. Thank you, Brother Troy McGahan. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for tuning in to the podcast today. I think we'll have another good one. We're always looking at Bible, looking at the world through the lens of a Bible with a heaping helping of country fried common sense.
Amen to that one.
And that's a hard thing to find in the American buffet today is common sense. It's
It
served
sure
anyway, steamed, raw, it doesn't matter. Common sense is a hard thing to find.
It's called uncommon sense now.
That's right. Well, if you don't know, my co-host today is Ronnie Qualls, and he's a good friend of mine, and it's a Saturday. We're at the bookstore, so the bookstore is open. We may have some people coming in and out. It's still kind of early. But the open sign's on, the door's unlocked. My wife's sitting at the counter, so if somebody comes in, as long as they don't pull a gun on us, we're just going to keep recording. If they pull a gun, return fire, okay?
There you go.
All right. Anyways, you're in town because, why?
I've been invited by Pastor Brian Stover at Dayton Bible Church. He called me about a month, a little bit more. I was actually preaching at a conference in San Antonio. And I looked down, and Brian's calling me, and he said, "Brother, I've been praying, and God's put you on my mind." He said, "We're going to be doing a revival this weekend." And he said, "Do you think you got 3 sermons?" And I said, "Well, I think I can probably do that."
I got 30.
And it's funny, I was just telling you that, sometimes you go into that blackout moment, and I thought I couldn't think of anything. And then all of a sudden I was just praying, and all of a sudden I have more sermons than I have times to preach, So
It's funny how God does that.
It is. Yeah.
I'm preaching tomorrow at my home church at West Park Baptist. My pastor's out of town. And he called me last week, and he said, "Hey, plan on preaching Sunday night, too. I'm not going to get back in time." And I said, "Okay." So I just preached 2 revival meetings in 2 different towns, different messages. I'm like, man, I got like 8 or 9 messages that I've recently preached that I really feel good about. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I got these other 2 sermons I hadn't preached yet. And I'm thinking about them. And I'm kind of like you. I'm like, oh, no, I got like this. I thought, here's one. This will be a good one. This is something's been on my mind. And instead it's like, man, which, it's weeded out time.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to do. If you're preaching a series of messages or you're preaching a couple times, it can be hard to try to determine which of those sermons is the right sermon. And now, we got these hyper cessationist guys out there that think that, it doesn't matter what you preach. You just do whatever you feel. It's up to you.
Right. I'm really not in that camp at all. Matter of fact, it's funny you say this because this morning, I'll tell you something else, and I think me and you's kind of like on this.
I hope so. It'll be the end of the podcast.
Yeah,
if
there we
not.
go. But everywhere I go, it isn't like I just want to grab a sermon that I've preached before. It's like it's a new place. It's a different group of people, and a lot of times it's like things I've preached in the past. I'm not going to preach that again, but. This morning, I got up, I was getting around, and I mean, I've got a lot of things on my mind,
right?
And I was thinking, there's two sermons that I really would, I could see me preaching either one of them tonight, and I said, Lord, I just need you to guide me. I don't know which way to go right here. So the book on Kenneth Cates, I pick it up and I start reading, and in there he says. Talking about just getting out in the woods, and he said I was just out and I was seeking God's face. Well, the one of the passages was 2 Chronicles 7:14.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, I really kind of poured some time into just like what is it to really seek His face,
Right.
And then I got to thinking. I thought just yesterday, he was talking about going out in the woods and praying, and he said the prayer would be so strong that I just felt His presence all around me. Well, when you study out, seek His face, it's talking about being in the presence of the Lord, him being present with you,
being face to face with him.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, well, here I was praying, and I said, I think I know which one I'm probably going to preach, and so I mean, it's just amazing. But and interestingly enough, I sit here, I'm telling you, I don't preach the same thing. It didn't start at Smithville. It started before that, but I preached on Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. Harold, I think it was like the next 5 times I preached. But every sermon, none of those sermons were alike.
Yeah. Well, you're not walking up there with 8 pages of notes you're trying to sort through.
No.
You're going up there with with it in your mind.
Yeah.
Fresh on your thoughts, prayed over, studied, and you're getting the outflow of what you've taken in. And I do the same thing. Of course, people that have seen my notes, it's usually an index card or something like that.
Right.
And that's usually one. It's usually just the front. And I just have enough on there to keep me on track. But there's nothing wrong with preaching a sermon in multiple places. I mean, I actually have people request, hey, when you come here, I want you to preach that sermon you got on such and such.
Right.
And it can be good somewhere else, but it always needs to be fresh.
Fresh. That's the thing. It's not that I haven't preached the same passages and things like that.
Sure.
But it's never the same. I mean, it is, but it's not, you know.
Yeah, I don't just go digging around in my shoebox full of notes and go, oh, here's one.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, let's do that one. No, I'm praying, and Lord, help me to meditate, think about it. I'm asking God to give me what these people need to hear.
Yes.
And that's a big part of it. And even in between books, if I'm pastoring a church, we're going through a book of the Bible. You know, I believe, I used to be the guy that I believe so much in verse by verse exposition that I did it in Sunday school, Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. And I thought, man, we're making great strides through the Bible. I'm covering 4 books a week, or 4 different books each week, and
yeah.
And then I thought, these people really need a message on finances. There's several families here struggling with how to handle their money. And you don't get a complete message on finance unless you run across a verse and then make that verse your springboard into going back and dealing with all. And I said, wait a minute, there's nothing unholy with me compiling a number of verses from Genesis to Revelation dealing with finances, compiling those together and preaching a topical message. God will not strike me down.
Yeah.
And then I look at these great preachers, the guy we call the Prince of Preacher. That's what he did nearly every Sunday.
Yeah.
And so I
never
was
preached
like,
a series.
Never. Yeah. So I'm like, okay, it's not, and thou shalt preach verse by verse expositionally or thou be damned. That's not what it says.
Right.
And so once I got over that, it's easier if you're in a book. I know what I'm preaching next week. It's the next verse forward.
Yeah.
The next verse forward. It saves you from a lot of combing the Bible, looking for ideas, but I have found it's beneficial to comb the Bible and look for ideas. Spurgeon used to say he had threw away thousands of sermons that he'd written out, prayed over, and said, nope, it's not the right one, crumpled it up, threw it in the trash can, and started preparing another one. Some Saturday nights, he would prepare 4 or 5 sermons.
Oh, I know.
And throw them all away but the last one.
Right.
And you compare that with the guys that say, oh, you should be studying 40 hours a week to preach an hour. And
well, I've always found it, the irony in when they tell you that, usually you're at a conference and everything's topical. And the topic they're covering is expositional preaching, like verse by verse. But I'm thinking, you're not doing that right now.
How did you expositionally come to expositional preaching?
Yeah, and but I'll tell you, when amongst conservative evangelicals, there was kind of a revival of sorts, and I'll use this term of like what I'd call the doctrines of grace or sovereign grace. But like everything, it always goes too far.
Yeah. And
next thing you know, you've got the guys that are way up here, and they're all saying, oh, you've got to do this, you can't do that, and everybody's sitting here like, oh, okay, I didn't,
You end up with more rules than anything.
Yes, and And funny about that one is it's like their rules are all topical. It's like we break down the Bible and
look when
systemize it. And
when you have a book with 6 chapters and you're preaching expositionally through it, and you've got 300 sermons, you preach 300 topical messages. You just let that book pick your topic.
Yeah.
But because you're averaging 50 sermons a chapter. There ain't even 50 verses a chapter. I mean, what you're dealing with a word. That's a topic.
Yeah. I had somebody tell me one time, they said, man, you need to listen to Martin Lloyd-Jones. You know, I was preaching through Ephesians, and he has 200 and almost 300 sermons in 6 chapters. And I was on the little part, you know, but God. Yeah. He had 3 or 4 sermons.
That was a series.
Just on but God.
Yeah, it was a series on 2 words.
And I thought,
that's a topical message, Ronnie, any way you slice it.
Exactly.
And look, Martin Lloyd-Jones did a good job with it.
Yes. I'm not saying what he did was wrong.
Right.
But don't say you're doing one thing.
Yeah.
Like, I love the guys who say they're going verse by verse, but they never it's like they section each thing off.
They isolate each individual verse.
And I thought, actually you just did topical to that whole book,
Go get an original Bible without chapters and verses in it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that ought to be considered.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, in the New Testament, primarily what we're preaching from is a letter that was one message delivered to a church.
And it didn't take 3 years to read that letter.
It didn't take 3 years to read
it. I'm in the middle of Romans right now. And I told my wife the other day, I said, especially starting with chapter 6, I'm like about in the middle of 7.
Yeah.
I said, I really want to just go 6, 7, and 8 all at one time.
Right.
But it just doesn't work that way.
Well, I got an idea for a sermon. And
easy now. I've been known to steal some guys' ideas.
I wouldn't say it on a podcast if I didn't expect it to be stolen. And there's going to be a race now because I think only one of them's on since I'm not pastoring anywhere where it's recorded.
Yeah,
I'm preaching this out in the backwoods in some little church, and only that congregation's heard them. But I got an idea when I was attending. My daughter-in-law got baptized over at First Baptist Roland.
Oh.
And she grew up Methodist. Her dad's a Methodist pastor.
Gotcha.
And good Christian lady, just didn't understand the Baptist view of baptism until she met our son, and then became convicted of it and wanted to follow the Lord's example in baptism by immersion.
Yeah, okay.
After salvation.
Right.
So, and wanted to be a member of the church in Roland and be able to serve there. So that was her motivation. And so I wanted to go see her be baptized, and support her and support Brother Gary Fitzpatrick, the pastor there. I mean, I was interim pastor at Roland for nearly a year and a half before Brother Gary came on. And so it was a chance to go back to church. Well, Gary was preaching on, I think it's John 15, the vine and the branches.
Oh,
I am the vine, you are the branches. And he was doing a very good job with it, and I was enjoying his message. But what jumped out at me was if a branch doesn't produce fruit, it's plucked off the vine, and it's dropped on the ground, and it's gathered up for the fire. And then if a branch does produce fruit, it's pruned so that it produces more fruit. And I said, what I really want to do is just contrast the unfruitful and the fruitful.
Right.
That's all I wanted to do. And so I was sitting here and I was like, I got the tale of 2 branches, And so I started contrasting the saved and lost, and they were grafted in. The branches are grafted into the vine. Some grafts don't take. The sap flows all around them. It doesn't go up in them.
Right.
And so I had all these illustrations and applications, and then I said, well, man, I got the tale of 2 branches, and I got the tale of 2 boys. One boy stayed home, and one boy went abroad. They were both prodigal.
Yeah, exactly.
And so then I started thinking about 2s. I'm like, man, the Bible's full of 2s. We got the 2 sufferers. We got Lazarus suffering here. We got the rich man suffering over there.
Right.
And so instantly, before service let out, I had like 3 sermon thoughts running through my mind. None of it had to do with what Gary preached. It just got my mind turning. Well, by the time I got to Bethel, Oklahoma, to preach a revival at Bethel Missionary Baptist for Vincent Troxell's pastors, I had a series of messages, and I'd changed everything to an S. So I had the tale of two servants. I had the tale of two sufferers. I had the tale of two sons. I had the tale of two sticks. Instead of branches, I changed it to sticks. But going with the S theme, I had two sides of the ship, the side Peter fished on and the side the Lord told him to drop the net down on.
Yeah.
You know, I admire Peter. He was doing what was right. He was working. He was trying to provide. But God told him he's supposed to be fishing for men.
Yes.
And so when the Lord rebukes him, he doesn't chew him out. He gently says, Peter, son, if you need fish, I got them. They're already cooked there on the coals, you know. So I had this series of messages, the tale of two searches, where one search is to go out and get those that were bidden to the feast. And the guy's got land that he bought and never seen. Who buys land, never lays eyes on it? One guy's got 5 yoke of oxen. He doesn't know if they'll plow. Well, who buys 5 tractors doesn't know if they'll start.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's the search for the respectable and influential crowd. They don't want to come to the feast.
Right.
So the master of the feast says, go out on another search. Go into the streets and the lanes. And they said, hey, we got everybody. And he said, go out into the highways and the hedges. Those are the searches for the rejected and the insignificant. And the application there, Ronnie, is our churches, you know, we want to get a doctor and a lawyer and a banker. You know, we want this crowd to come to church. And instead, he says, go out and get the lame, the blind,
right.
the halt, the born crippled. All of that to say, I just started on this theme of twos. Then I preached on the tale of two swords. There was only 2 swords in all of Israel. Jonathan had one and Saul had one. Saul's the king. He's hiding under a pomegranate tree with this last 600 men. Jonathan says to his armor bearer, says, hey, let's me and you go up and fight all the Philistines we can find tonight. Right. And they go out and start a revolution that runs them out. And I'm like, whose sword do you want to be?
Yeah.
You know, same problem, same issue, same enemy.
Yeah.
You're not going to preach messages like I just described to you if you're going verse by verse through a book. You're not going to make the application. You're not going to be able to do that. It's not because it's not in the text. It's just an approach to the text. And I'm not saying that exposition's the only way. I'm not saying what I'm doing's the only way. I really think a healthy church needs a dose of both.
Right.
It needs somebody to come in and be application heavy.
Yes.
But that's how Christ preached. In my opinion, Christ gave parables. And the explanation of the parable was the message.
Right.
And I think we're missing that in conservative Christian circles.
Well, the thing of it is, it's like men always want to control things. So you got the intellectual guys, you know, that, like you said, the hyper cessationist type guy.
Right.
And they want to just make it all intellectual and logical and all this. And it's just like just like what you're telling me. I'm always like, Harold is really gifted and able to put, you know, a little point to everything and alliterate it, you know. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I can do that. Most of the time I can't.
The Spirit moves where it listeth.
Here's the problem. Even when I do it, I'm really proud of myself. I forget to tell them the points as I get there. So I blew it anyway.
I remember you doing that one time. You got to the end of your message and you said, oh, I had all these alliterated points. And you read them. I thought that was hilarious.
I mean, that, you know, so, but the thing that happens that I fear is that God doesn't gift people the exact same way.
No.
And it's like, quit tampering with what God is doing.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. You listen to old Vance Havner. Vance was quick-witted, things like that, you know, and the guys that have gone on, like Spurgeon, you know, we always hear about, like I said, expository preaching, but yet he never preached a series ever.
Yeah.
Never preached through a book. But everybody gets a free pass, it's dead.
Yeah.
But now they're going to try to control what goes forward, and you just can't do it.
Yeah.
You got to, everybody is wired in a different way. I promise you. Do I like going to the pulpit without any notes? Not really. Even though that's the way I learned to do it, I would still rather have something. But it's like I told my wife, I said, now I might jot something down here in a little bit. But I said, here's the thing. I know what I'm going to preach. but there's this feeling inside me that I'm not sure what I'm going to say exactly on this part.
Right.
It hadn't been given yet, but
Yeah.
but I have the experience to know that God's going to give it.
Yeah.
And I said, I just rest in that. Now, other people would hear that and would.
Let me ask
They
you a
would freak
question.
out.
Have you ever preached anywhere and they asked to see a copy of your notes before you came to approve or disapprove?
No, but I've heard of other people. No, I don't think anybody has ever done that to me, but I've often thought if that happens, I'm gonna be like, I don't have any.
That's what I had to say. The guy said it'd be nice if we could have a copy of your notes a week in advance.
Yeah,
I was like, be nice if I could make notes out in a week in advance.
exactly.
And he messaged back and he's like, well, are you just too busy to prepare a lesson? I said, bro, I prepare the lesson the day of.
Yeah,
I said, it's in my head rolling around,
Yeah.
you know. I kind of feel like I got a bunch of thoughts in there, and there's like one of them ping pong ball turners.
Yes.
You know, and it just keeps jumbling them around, and every once in a while it's number B4. And this thought comes out, and we're like, hell, that's good. Put that one over here. And we just keep turning, and there's thoughts just bubbling up. And I'm like, oh, that's good too.
I understand that completely.
Is that how your mind works?
My mind is like, I describe it like this. It's like I got these snapshots of this sermon, and they're not in order.
Yeah, right.
I mean, some of them are in the very end. You know, some of them are here, and it's like, and I'm sometimes almost in panic. Like, I'd like to get these in a good order, you know. But like you said, that order, I'm telling you, I could sit there all day long the day before.
Yeah.
Nothing. And the day of, it'll all just start clicking, and I can kind of put down some thoughts. You know, coming here, I
wouldn't tell everybody to do it the way you and I are doing it.
No.
But what I would tell people is, man, it's not a sin to preach a topical message. It's not a sin to preach a series of topical messages. It's not a sin to preach verse by verse expositionally. Just don't get stupid. I heard a guy one time preach, and he said, don't follow your feelings. And I was like, okay. And it said, Isaac followed his feelings when he was feeling of Jacob's arms and feeling of Jacob's neck. And I'm like, that's the sense of touch. That's not an emotional response, dude. These are two different. That's feel. Like I can feel something. That's not going off, oh, I'm so sentimental and my feelings have been hurt. I was like, go find somewhere else to go off. Don't go off your feelings.
Oh my goodness. As I heard.
But I mean, there's a big gap between that and John MacArthur. There's a lot of good ground in between that.
Yes. And like, I'll just say this about John MacArthur. I believe God has gifted John to do what John does. Obviously, you know.
And he surrounded him with men to make that known.
Yes. And so I can rejoice in that, you know. You was asking about, nobody's ever asked me ahead of time for my notes, but I had preached and somebody'd say, hey, can I see your notes? And I'd hand it, they'd go,
yeah.
You preached that out of that? And I'm like, you know.
The Sunday they tried to fire me at Lee Creek. So it was a railroad meeting that Saturday night. I was having dinner with my family and my in-laws out in town, and the deacon called me and said, we need you at church right now. So I left supper and drove to the office, and my wife and her family rode home together.
No, wait, did you have a feeling you knew what was going on?
I had no idea.
Okay, wow.
I had no idea.
Wow.
Yeah. But the family that was going to fire me, they'd all been at church camp. They were the ones that ran the church. They'd been at church camp. And anyways, they formed all their plans while they were gone. And then I stayed around church till all the kids got picked up. I said, man, I know y'all's tired. Y'all can go on home. They didn't go home. They went door to door. I released them, and I watched the kids at church till all the parents showed up to pick them up for another hour.
Wow.
They were going door to door, running me down, trying to get me fired. So long story short, I say all that. I don't even remember where I was going with that. They were trying to fire me. The next Sunday morning, I didn't resign. They wanted me to resign Saturday night. I didn't resign. I said, you vote me out. They said, we're going to vote you out in the morning. I said, that'll be fine. I'll be here for that. So I showed up. I answered questions. I defended all these false charges against me. We had a vote. That family and two couples voted to remove me. The rest of the church voted to keep me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so they lost, and everybody was clapping and applauding, and I'm like, hey.
No kidding?
Oh, yeah. Oh, they didn't want me to leave. I mean,
Yeah.
this family had lost control of their church.
Yeah.
That's what happened. So I said, this is not a happy, clappy time, guys. This is not something to rejoice in. I mean, I'm glad that I'm here, But this family's got to come forward and decide whether they want to repent for what they've done. I didn't say this family. I said the 11 people that voted for me to be removed need to come forward and either repent and ask the church to forgive them for what they've done, or they need to find another church. I kid you not, they huddled up just like an offense and called a play. The spokesperson came forward and said, we just want to apologize to the church. We waited so long to get rid of Brother Harold. We lost. We lost the vote. We're leaving, and we're not going to cause any trouble. I said, well, okay. So they all left.
Wow.
Never had a bad business meeting after that. But I had a sermon that I was going to preach that morning. And the weird thing was, it was the rare time that I had prepared it on a Saturday.
Oh, wow.
Normally, I prepare it Sunday morning. I get up 4:30 in the morning and start writing out a sermon. Weird times, I prepared it on a Saturday. Well, we didn't have a preaching session Sunday morning. We had a vote to fire me or keep me. And I canceled Sunday night service because, I hadn't slept all night. Dude, this all transpired like at 9 o'clock to midnight. I had people calling my house in the middle of the night. Brother Harold, I can't sleep. God won't let me go to bed. This is wrong. I'm like, it's okay. I'll get fired in the morning and it'll all be behind us. So I said, we're dismissing evening service. We'll all come back Wednesday and I'll have a plan of how we're going to go forward. Well, I was scheduled to preach in Oklahoma at a brotherhood meeting with a whole bunch of churches Monday night.
Oh, wow.
And, of course, my phone rang all Sunday afternoon. I slept like a log all Sunday night. Monday, I was getting phone calls. Word was spreading that, what all had happened. And it wasn't just people in the church, and it wasn't just pastors in other churches. It was people in the community. Brother Harold, I got your number from so-and-so. I just want to say thank you for standing up. I was the 6th pastor in 13 years, when I came there. So
wait, did they other guys get fired because of that family?
I can't say that for
Okay.
certain. One guy ran off with another woman.
Oh,
the guy that stayed the longest, his son married a granddaughter out of the family, so that kind of kept him there longest. But not everyone was fired, but there was a lot of turmoil in the church from day one. So I was like, man, I've got to preach to a group of men from a bunch of different churches across eastern Oklahoma tonight at 6 o'clock. And I was like, well, I got this sermon on Hebrews 11 that I had prepared rarely on a Saturday for Sunday. I'm like, it's good enough for Lee Creek, it's good enough for them. I didn't know what else to do. I was mentally just drained, Ronnie.
Oh, I bet.
I'd been through the ringer.
Gosh.
So I walk in over there, and the pastor, he's passed away now. His name was Rick Kester. It's First Baptist Church of Arcoma. Brother Rick and I had been good friends for a long time, and I'd only known him a few years back then. We're talking this is 15, longer than that maybe. It's 15, 16 years ago when this happened. So I go walking in over there, and Brother Rick's like, hey, Brother Harold, how you doing, man? He's old enough to be my dad, but we've been good friends, right? And so I said, well, I'm doing pretty good considering I almost got fired yesterday. He goes, what? And I said, yeah. And he goes, what in the world? And he kind of knew a little history on our church.
Yeah.
And he said, did they vote to fire you? I said, no, they tried. They voted. One family voted to fire me. The rest of the church voted to keep me. I'm still the pastor, and they're gone. He goes, my goodness, all that happened? I said, yeah. And he goes, are you ready to preach? I said, oh, yeah, man, I got me a sermon that I prepared on Saturday for Lee Creek. And he goes, so you're going to preach what? I said, I think it's great. It's on, I think it was Hebrews 11:1 or something.
Yeah.
Anyways, so I got up in front of these men, and I preached exactly my notes for Sunday morning. I'm like you. I got enough empty spots in there. I can make this sermon about these men. I can put their application in there instead of my home church's applications in there on the go. And when I got done, there was a bunch of men down at the altar praying. I don't normally give, invitation time.
Right.
I was like, man, there's like a bunch of people came forward. It's kind of, encouraging and a little bit surprising. And Brother Rick's up in the pulpit, and I'm sitting on the front row, and he's like, Harold, would you mind if I shared with them what happened to you yesterday? I think these men need to know what you've gone through in light of what you just preached. I said, I don't care. So he told him, he goes, this guy was in a church vote Sunday morning to fire him. And I was like, I was kind of like, man, I feel like, So I was just sitting there. And so he said, and by God's grace, he's still there. And that family's left. And he's been through the ringer. And he's coming here and poured his heart out tonight to us. Well, when he got done saying all that, the men felt like they all needed to come up front and shake my hand and encourage me and pat me on the back. So there's a big, long procession of people coming by.
How many men was at this thing?
Probably, man, it's been a long time. I'd say 50.
Oh, yeah?
Maybe 60. Probably 13 churches represented, There's a lot of pastors there. Well, then when they all got done, with my brother praying for you thing, it was over. A pastor came up to me. He said, I want your notes. I'm preaching that sermon at such and such Baptist Church Sunday. And I was like, okay. I said, well, I don't have a lot of notes, man. They're handwritten on an index card. And he goes, that's all right. I handed him that index card, and I saw other men over there running up to him. I thought, what in the world are they doing? And I said, brother, I need that back. I'm going through Hebrews. I'm going to preach that Sunday, He said, I'm bringing it back to you. He went back there and made copies of it and passed them out to the guys, the preachers that were there. And the men was all like, brother, if you ever get fired, you let me know. You can come preach in our church, And the director of mission came up to me and he said, son, he was this real old man. He said, son, if that church ever turns loose of you, you'll be preaching the next Sunday in Sequoia County or LaFleur County or whatever it was, Yeah. He goes, I'll have you in a church over here tomorrow. He goes, don't let them people run over you, And it was all based on one sermon that was preached, and what I'd been through the day before. But I say all that to say, there's no way them guys took my notes and preached that sermon the next day, the next Sunday.
Yeah, that's just it. There's no way that could happen.
Yeah.
They're not you.
Well, look, there was 2 churches there that didn't have a pastor, and both of them, said, hey, I'm on the search committee. I said, bro, I'm not leaving. I just survived a vote. The people that hate me all just walked out the door.
Exactly.
And, and that's the weird thing about pastoring a church is there was times at Lee Creek later on where it was just kind of dead. Nothing was happening. And I was like, Lord, I want to go somewhere and fight a group of old deacons. I want to get back in the action. We're just sitting over here preaching and everybody's shaking hands and smiling and hugging but we're not growing. And what we were doing was healing.
Yeah.
When you get busted up, you got to learn how to heal. And I just wanted to jump back in a fight. I'm like, okay, we got stitches. I'm not bleeding. Let's find another church that needs straightened out. Let's find another family that needs their clutches pried off the body. And now, I do a lot of that kind of ministry, but I had to learn to pastor a church when it healed. And then I had to learn to pastor a church when it grew. Our church grew when I came there. It went from about 40 to 80 in 2 years in attendance. Wow. The 80 that were coming were not, fire-breathing, water-walking, Christians. And they needed to grow. Just getting a lot of people in the door is easy. If you want young families in your church, just offer programs for young families. They'll show up. If you want old people, just start you a senior adult ministry. They'll show up. But a good, healthy church is not in its attendance. It's in its adherence. It's adherence to the word. It's in its affections to the other members. And so while we were running 80 at Lee Creek in those early days, the church wasn't united. You still had this family over here that was jealous of all these new members that were getting in their way, changing their program. And so what happened was we shrank down real small. I thought, hey, we're just losing 11 people and a few kids to go with them. This is no big deal. No, we lost a bunch of people. And it wasn't over me being there. It was, we had older folks that just started passing away.
Oh, yeah.
After this. And we had people that got transferred with their job out of state. We had people that retired, like, hey, man, I'm going to have to retire early. We're going to move back to our home that we have. And I was like, man, all these good people that survived this vote and were here to support me, all left. And when we got down real small, I'm like, Lord, why are you doing this? I just send me somewhere else. Let me go fight somewhere else. And he said, no, while you're small. And he didn't say this audibly, but I believe God still speaks. And no, I don't have a chapter and verse. This is clearly what needed to be done.
Right.
While you're small, let's get everything in order. And so while we were down to like 25 or 30, we started the Preachers of Grace Conference at 25 or 30.
Oh, wow.
I wanted to do it when we had 80 and had lots of money coming in. Now, you're going to do it when you have 25 or 30. That's when we adopted a doctrinal statement, finalized what we all believe. That's when I taught policies on how to receive members and what's expected of them. And we all affirmed that. That's when we cleaned up our church rolls. That's when we did all the dirty work, the not fun work. That's when we put together a budget. I say that because we got small to do that. And then from there, we went back. But when we built back in unity. We built back in doctrinal unity. Right. We built back in love for one another. And we guarded the front door so we didn't have to use the back door nearly as often.
Yeah.
And that's what builds a healthy church. I had to learn that because jump forward 17 years, that's what I do. That's my ministry. I go into unhealthy churches and say, no, I've been here. I've done this. I can spot the families in here. It's different names, same role. And here's the way we fix that. Here's what's necessary for a church to be healthy, and start laying that groundwork and get that ugly work done. And then have another pastor come in. So I go in and frame it up. Somebody else come in and put a bathroom vanity in, put cabinets in, sheetrock and wallpaper, roll out nice carpet. That's another guy's work. And I learned to do all those things over the years. But my point is, Ronnie, and I shouldn't be talking so long, but when you're engaged in this kind of work, a lot of people tell me, I'm doing what you do, man. I do the same thing you do. And this is what I always think. Okay, what church did you go into that was in this shape, that the Lord sustained you all the way through it and saw you nurture it all the way back to health as a shepherd? What rough flock did God say, care for these sheep? And you trusted in him and walked with him and fought lions and fought bears with him, and you combed out knots in their hair, and you sheared them when it was time to shear them, and you bandaged them when you bandaged them, and you took care of the young lambs until the flock was healthy and large and well fed. Because you can't go into the ministry that I go into of going into broken churches unless the Lord's used you in a broken church to get it healed up and back on track.
Exactly. I mean, there's a lot of people that have programs. There's a lot of people that can give you books
Southern
to
Baptists
read.
are the world's best.
But you've got to have somebody that's willing to go do it. The church I previously was in over at Sovereign Grace in Ada, Oklahoma, we would talk about going out, into the mission field. And I want to be careful how I say this, because where I'm at now is I'm at First Baptist Bowlegs in Bowlegs, Oklahoma. But when I went out there...
By the way, that's where my great-grandparents are buried.
Yeah, I remember you telling me that. Yeah, so I'm going to have to go find that cemetery, man.
Next time I come over there, I'm going to.
Yeah, but, I never wanted to go pastor a traditional Baptist church. Now, what I would do, though, is I'd preach about that even churches out there a lot of times need somebody to come in because they've just lost track. They're just, it's like, what is this? What are you doing? It's all about everything but the Lord, Now, I'm not going to say that's the way Bowlegs was, but going over there, you could feel that there just needed to be probably a stronger unity and stuff. So I told them there would be a couple of changes if I came, and this is what it would be. And I said, if you don't want that, that's fine. I said, I'll still help you all I can, but I'm not your guy. I promise you. And, here we are. And, I've been there over 5 years now.
Yeah.
And,
And you've got a really good ministry there.
Yeah, and you know, a while back, our director of missions in our association, he called me up and he said, "Brother," he said, "I wish every church in our association was doing what you guys are doing." And I'm like, not sure what we're doing. And he said, "Man, you guys have a preaching factory over there."
Yeah.
And I said, "What?" And he had went and listened to one of our young guys, a brother named Daniel Reyna. He had went to preach 4 Sundays in a row at a little church that had no one. I mean, it's really one of the places you're talking about that you deal with. And he went over and snuck in and listened to him preach. And he said, "Man, I know one thing. When your guys go out to preach," he said, "man, they preach the word, you know."
Yeah.
And now the funny thing is, Harold, is this. I didn't go over some game plan like I'm going to develop great preach. You know,
No.
I just go over and preach.
Yep.
I don't even have a reference to bounce off what I'm doing compared to the guy or guys before me.
Yeah.
I just do what I do. Now, when I preach and the way I talk about the word, there's a real strong emphasis on preach the word.
Yeah.
You know, and so I was telling a brother over named Nathan, and I said, you know, Tim told me that, and I said, I didn't know what to say. I said, I didn't do none of that. And he said, "No, man." He said, "When you came," he said, "it raised the bar on everybody's teaching and everything, you know." Yeah. Now, that is just the work of the Lord.
Sure.
You know, and I honestly, I didn't know how else to do it. I mean, I've always looked at the word of the Lord as this is God's word.
Yeah.
Preach it. I mean, I'm not apologizing.
You know, we mentioned MacArthur earlier, and his slogan is unleashing God's truth one verse at a time.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
the slogan. If a guy goes in and just makes the Bible known, the Bible will have its effect.
Exactly.
If you model biblical preaching, which is adherence and accuracy to the Word of God, whether you're doing it in a topical format, a series, expositionally, verse by verse, it doesn't matter. If you're adhering to the Word of God and what you're saying is in harmony with God's Word,
Yeah.
and there's an application to it for now, this will happen. I wasn't a preaching factory. I was a graveyard for old preachers. That's what I used to say. I where old preachers come to teach Sunday school. You know, I think at one time there were 7 former pastors in our church.
Okay, let me ask them. I've heard you say that. Do you think that they came, like they're not looking to pastor anymore?
Well, some of them were retired pastors. Some of them were guys that maybe pastored for a little bit in their life.
Okay.
You know, maybe pastored a church or two. Some of them were elders, you know, that probably weren't the, you know, up front preaching pastor, but served in an elder capacity. And some of them were just guys that said, "Hey, I'm called to preach," and they went out and preached, you know, and some of them were former missionaries. And if I look back, I mean, at one time there were 7 of them all at one time there.
Right.
But if I look back, I can think of other guys that, hey, you know, this church fired me. They came to Lee Creek until they found a place, or they resigned a church. They came to Lee Creek for a year.
What do you think brought him to Lee Creek? Do you think it's because here's a guy that does preach the word? I mean, he's not playing games, you know.
2 things. I think it's preaching, and I also think it's healthy church.
Yeah.
You can go into a church that has a let's just say a good preacher, okay? You can go into a church that has a good preacher, and you can hear a good sermon every Sunday. But if it's as cold as a block of ice,
right,
you don't want to go there you don't want to go to the fellowships. You don't want to be a part. And the thing that people used to say to me, they were like, "Man, do you worry any of those guys want your job?" And I was like, "No, I don't, because the Lord's called me to be the pastor there."
Right.
And there was a time when the ministry that I do now was getting so big, I was exhausted from doing what I do now, and I pastored a church on the side.
Yeah.
You know, and I was like, "Lord, I need a fellow elder. I need somebody to come in and take the church load off of me." And, and praying about that, and I was like, "Man, you've got like right now 3 or 4 men that have been ordained as elders or pastors, you know, but none of them would have been the right guy to do what I needed done. I needed help. I needed somebody to shepherd the flock.
Right.
These guys were just not the right men for the work I needed. So I began to pray for deacons. I thought, man, if I could just have some deacons to handle the day-to-day stuff, I'll show up and preach, and then I can spend my week, doing what I need to do in other churches for pastors. Never got it. And it just kept, neither one backed off. Church was still growing, ministry still growing, more phone calls, more new members. And I was like, Lord, I've been praying for a year. Associate pastor, elder. I don't care what kind of title you want to give him. I got to have some help.
Right.
And then it was like, maybe, I just assumed I'd never leave Lee Creek. I'd never pastor anywhere else. I came here to die. Once God got through to me like, hey, Harold, I sent you to Lee Creek. I can take you out of Lee Creek.
Yeah.
I called you to preach, pastor. I can call you to go and shepherd other places too. And God had to get that through to me. No, I don't have a chapter and verse for that, but he told me that.
Right.
So I took a week off, and my wife and I left, and we were just going to go out west and drive through the Rocky Mountains, and we went and saw a bunch of national parks and monuments and whatnot, and just spent a week unplugged. And I checked my emails like 2 or 3 times that week just to make sure somebody wasn't dead and I need to come back and do a funeral or something. And every time I would check my email, it wouldn't be anything from Lee Creek. It would be some church saying, hey, we can't find a pastor. Do you know anybody in Mississippi? Do you know anybody in Kentucky? Every time I checked my email, that's what I got. Right. And I had my phone turned off most of the time.
Yeah.
So I told Missy during that time, I said, babe, what do you think about me just being a missionary to these kind of churches? Because I can't do both, and God's not giving me an associate pastor. Or I had 2 men that I was convinced needed to be deacons. I still think they would be great deacons. One of those men still go to Lee Creek. I still think he'd be a great deacon. I said, I've got these 2 guys in mind to ordain as deacons, but if the Lord's going to move me, the last thing you need to do is ordain 2 deacons and leave. Those 2 deacons will become de facto elders whether they want to or not.
Right.
Especially if the next pastor don't stay very long, they'll just look back to their only leaders. This is how deacons run churches. They don't get together and meet in the basement of the Masons Lodge and form plans to take over churches. It happens by default because pastors don't stay.
Exactly. They feel like it's on them to protect the church.
Right. And so I didn't want to ordain deacons and leave. So I asked my wife, I said, let's pray this week while we're out here. Let's think. If you got questions, let's talk it out. Because she didn't want to leave. She was like me. I'm going to spend the rest of my life here. And I said, right. I do too. I became convinced by the end of that week, like, wow, I'm done. And we had Preachers of Grace conference. Maybe we had Preachers of Grace first, and then I took the vacation. I don't remember, but at Preachers of Grace, I pulled a couple men aside. And after it was over, his last day, everybody kind of left. I think it was like Danny Thursby, Alan Nelson was there, Eddie Ragsdale. These 3 guys we were all just standing around talking after Preachers of Grace. And I said, guys, I feel like I'm called to go to struggling churches and do over what I did here in the early days of Lee Creek. And I'm already doing it. I'm just doing it from my office over the phone. I really feel like I need to be hands-on in these churches doing it. Do you think I have the gifts to pull that off? And all 3 of them just sitting there were looking at me just like shocked. And they were like, Harold, if anybody is gifted to do that, it's you. And I said, okay. I said, do you think there's any chance I could do that and churches support me in the work? And they were like, oh, absolutely. You're the most well-connected pastor we have, in the state. You have all these other friends in the ministry. If anybody could pull this off, it's you.
Right.
So I began just to sit there and ponder that. And I said, well, guys, I feel like that's what I want to do. And they all was like, yeah, we'll be praying for you. I said, hey, look, don't tell anybody this because I've got to sit down and put all this together, and then I've got to tell the church. And so I prayed about it. By the end of that week, after talking to those men, after us taking a week off and discussing it, I was convinced. I was done at Lee Creek, and I wasn't supposed to be looking for more elders or a associate pastor or, the church needed deacons, but I wasn't I wasn't going to stay there. And so I made a list of all the things I thought the church needed that were on my to-do list.
Yeah.
And I left them for the next pastor. And I said, hey, I'm not dumping these on you. I just didn't want you to inherit my choices. So you handle it as you see fit. And I stepped down as pastor. Of course, they kept me on the search committee. I mean, that's what I do, is help churches find pastors. And
right.
So I was on the search committee that found the pastor that replaced me, Joseph Allen. And I say all that to say, though, it's the Lord's church. He's called us to pastor it. He could send me to the largest church in Arkansas to be their pastor. I don't think that'd be a good fit, but if that's what the Lord wants, he would make it work. Or he could send me to the absolute worst church in the state of Arkansas. Yeah. And that's his decision. That's his doing. And I go back to the theological depth of what I said in preschool Sunday school class. I'm in the Lord's army.
Yeah.
He's the boss.
Yeah.
He points and whistles and I go and jump. And if he says, Harold, you're going into this trench over here and you're going to fight off these snipers, that's where I'm going to go.
Well, that right there, the fact that God can do with you as he wants. When I came out of the Church of the Firstborn, part of me thought, churches would like to have me.
Did you ever think, will I ever get my cult back, or am I just going to be?
No, this is what I thought. I thought, okay, I'm out of that. I'm in the big world of Christianity.
Sure.
And I kind of thought that the way people would think is like, hey, here's a guy that came out of that, and we'd like to have him come in and share that stuff,
Yeah.
Well, that's not the way it worked. It worked more like, hey, that guy was in a cult.
Yeah, watch him.
And I was always a little naive to some things, but I remember just walking down the road praying. I had gone quite a while without preaching anywhere.
Yeah.
And I mean, I was frustrated and confused, and when I go and pray, man, I'll be waving my arms around and stuff. If you're filming, you think, this guy's nuts,
We got a psycho walking down the road, he's talking to himself.
Exactly. But as I was walking down the road, I was praying, and I said, God, if you've called me to preach, why am I not preaching? Now, here's one of those things. I didn't hear an audible voice, but I believe that God speaks to you. And the Lord asked me two questions. First question was, he said, do you think I need you to preach? And immediately it's just like, no. I mean, I'm just one of thousands of preachers,
Yeah, right.
But the second question was a lot stiffer. It was like, if I never use you to preach again, is Jesus enough for you? And then I started thinking, what is my identity in? Is it in that I'm in Christ, or is it that I preach? I'm a preacher of the gospel,
Wow.
Yeah, that one was heavy. And I just thought, Lord, you can use me however you want. And, during that time, I came out to DeWitt, Arkansas, and guys asked me to come out and preach like a weekend. Well, the weekend turned into the whole next week. And when I left there, now while I was there.
Was this a Bible church, Baptist church? What was it down there?
This was a church that probably 20 plus years earlier had pulled out of the Church of the Firstborn. They were just non-denominational. They would have been very Baptistic, though, in their doctrine and such. And I went there. Now, the week before I was there, apparently there was some guy that was on a big news station in Arkansas. I think he was a weatherman or something, and he turned into an evangelist. And he had been he'd been
lying so long they gave him a job in the ministry.
Now, I don't know if he was a good guy or a bad guy, but
I don't believe weathermen.
Well, yeah, no kidding.
They lie 6 times a week.
Exactly. But he had been at there's a big Methodist church in DeWitt, Arkansas. And he had been there the week before, and somebody had told me that to get him to come in, it was several $1,000s.
Really?
And when I heard that, I was like, what? Because in the Firstborn, nobody paid you. You were never paid anything. Not as a pastor, not anything.
They cook you dinner.
So I go to DeWitt, and at the end of that week, while I'm standing there, they said, everybody, we're going to take up a love offering for Brother Ronnie, I'd never even heard of a love offering. And I was like, what are they doing? And man, people started getting out their billfolds, and it embarrassed me. I don't get embarrassed much, but I didn't know what to do with this. Now let's just say, man, they really blessed me. I'll just say that. But I remember leaving there, and man, I was rejoicing on one hand, but I was, this paying thing. It was so weird and foreign to me. But I was thinking about this guy that got paid thousands of dollars to come in,
Mm-hmm.
And I remember telling the Lord this. I said, it was like, here I was preaching, and things were kind of opening up. And I said, Lord, I don't know about this getting paid. And,
right.
and I thought, Lord, what do these little churches do that can't pay these guys to come in? And I said, Lord, I'll go whatever. I don't care how small the place is, how obscure it is.
Right.
And I said, I will never charge a dime.
Yeah.
I said, I don't know about this love offering thing, but Lord, if they want to do that, okay, but on my part.
Call it a free will offering.
Yeah.
It troubles the Reformed guys if you do that. Just say it's a free will offering.
Well, I told him later at DeWitt, that church, I said, listen, y'all don't ever do that to me again. If you want to do something like that, you do it when I'm not. I said, I do not ever want to be in. I mean, I'm sitting here, the whole focus is on me.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want people to feel like, oh, he's sitting there watching. And the truth is, I didn't know what they were doing,
Yeah.
But going back, it's just like God, however God wants to use me, wherever it is, just like coming to Brian Stover's church last night there at Dayton Baptist Church. I mean, it's a small church. I mean, they were shut down for 2 years. Then Brian, steps in there.
They gave the building to Brian and said, here, man,
here's a small little group of people, but I'm just the kind of guy that this is the kind of things and the kind of people that God uses.
Bingo. Yeah.
And it's like, it seems like no matter how much we fight against, like it's not about popularity, it's not about numbers and stuff. There's always that creeping in us.
Yeah.
I don't, if numbers aren't increasing,
Right.
am I doing something wrong? Nobody knows me, and I'll just say this, like at our church, you was talking earlier about, man, I'm ready for another fight. I have found lately that people ask me, how are things going at Bowlegs? I said, it's going really good. And I'm sitting here like, I don't really know what to do. I'm not real good on autopilot.
Yeah.
But what God has done, we've ordained 2 more elders, and one of them, he's just like, man, the pulpit is not where I feel confident. And not confident, but called, so much. Does a great job like on Sunday school, Bible study type things. And he's real good at like just taking care of so much of the technical things.
Right.
The other guy's a young man named Nathan, and he does feel a call to preach, and he does a really good job. So I went to him a while back, and I said, man, you want to start preaching one Sunday a month. So like the first Sunday of the month, he preaches. But in the meantime, what's happened, in this year, I've preached at 3 or maybe 4 conferences, maybe just 3. And then Brian called me for this, and it's just like all of a sudden there's just more of these opportunities. So the way it's kind of working is God just seems to be opening doors, because I've always felt a strong call to go into places like revivals and mission type stuff, and people have told me, they said, man, you preach so much better when you're doing that. I'm like, well, I don't know what to tell you. It's just.
Well, this is the other thing. You talk about letting the Lord do with you what he wants. My ministry is diversified. So we're sitting here at the bookstore on a Saturday where we give away free Christian literature every Saturday from 9 to 5. That's a good ministry, but that's not all that I do. That's just one little aspect. Behind this wall here where the bear rug's hanging is a room you've been in many times. Is where we have pastor fellowships. We've met with church leaders in there. We've met with multiple churches to discuss missions. Once a month, pastors meet in there and fellowship for... We call it a pastor's lunch, but, dude, it starts at 10 o'clock and runs till 4 o'clock. It's 6 hours of lunch.
Right.
And but that's not what I do. That's just one little blip on my monthly, cart. Then I do a lot of itinerant preaching, just like what you're talking about, conferences, revivals, filling pulpits.
Oh, no, you do a lot. I do a little bit.
Well, I didn't do as much when I pastored a church, because I would just tell them, hey, look, Lee Creek is where I was at. When I was pastor, this is where I'm at. Now, when I take an interim pastorate, which is what hopefully will come up in the future. I just tell people, hey, man, I'm not booking revivals. I might do 2 a year. My focus is at this church. I got to be their pastor. I'm here Sundays and Wednesdays. If you need me on a Saturday, I'll try to help you, but I'm here Sundays and Wednesdays. The hard part for me to learn is the Lord's in charge of where that next interim pastorate is and how long it takes to get it where it needs to be before I'm done.
Right.
He's also in charge of this gap in between. When I finished up at West Park Baptist in Ozark, where I'm a member now, I had like 5 people coming up to me going, hey, I gave your name to, this church or that church and this church over here. And I just assumed, I'll take a week off, Missy and I'll go do something. And then some church is going to call me and I'm going to jump right back into the interim pastorate. And it didn't happen. And I left there in September and it didn't happen. December came and went. And I'm like, what in the world, Lord? Have you forgotten me?
Yeah.
Now, I was preaching in a lot of places because people said, hey, when you finish up over there at West Park, we want you to come into our church and yada, yada, yada. And
right.
So I did that for a while. And it was February of the next year. So I went from September of 22 to February of 23. I didn't have anywhere to interim pastor. And I felt like I need to be refunding these people's, giving to me. I'm not doing anything. I'm just going around
not
preaching.
by choice, but
by the Lord's doing. Well, what I had to learn is, dude, I had a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in that church. It wasn't like I was just going down there preaching 3 times a week and teaching Sunday school.
Right.
I was dealing with issues that were deep and long-seated and deep-rooted.
Yeah.
And it took a lot out of me. And so then when I went to Roland, you got to keep in mind, when you're going to a church that's nearly dead or about to split in half, every business meeting's a big deal. It's not you go in and read a treasurer's report and say amen and go home. Every business meeting is a potential for a blow-up. It takes a lot out of a guy to do the kind of interim work that I do. And so when I finished up at Roland in July of 24, I was like, Lord, I'd like to have 6 months before the next church calls me. I really need some recovery time. Well, I booked the next 6 months to preach. I'm talking about, I preached every Sunday for 6 straight months in a different church.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I didn't have a
Sunday.
Sunday.
Imagine ours was one of them.
I didn't have a Sunday off. I think it was.
Yeah.
I didn't have a Sunday off. And I was like, okay, man, hey, the Lord's using me, And so I was busy working the bookstore, encouraging pastors, phone calls with churches, talking to preachers in trouble, giving advice, doing my usual stuff. But I'm like, all right, honey, pack our bags. We're heading to Mississippi. We're heading to Georgia this weekend. We'll be in western Oklahoma. We're going to Texas. I had all this every weekend. I was traveling off somewhere, or I was doing a revival somewhere for a week. And I'd come back and have a week of stuff waiting on me to be done. So I did that from like July to December. And I was like, Lord, that was 6 months, but that really wasn't 6 months off, I didn't want 6 months of downtime, but I didn't really get to catch my breath.
That's
either.
like going on vacation and having to come home and rest up from vacation.
Yeah. So I had to learn, though, Ronnie. All right. As a pastor, I learned, hey, I'm going to take Friday off. Unless I got a funeral or somewhere to be, Friday I'm not coming into the office. I'm going to go fishing.
Right.
And I had those days. With this kind of ministry, I don't have those days. I can try to work them in, but you can't say, hey, on Friday I'm doing that when you're preaching somewhere Friday out of town, living in a motel, And I've had stretches where I was gone for 2 straight weeks, preached in 4 different churches, or preached 5 days in one place, and then come home, change my clothes, restock my suitcase, leave the next day for 4 more days.
Right.
And so I had to learn it's not a sin for you to take a week off and not really do anything but answer the phone and work the bookstore.
Yeah.
Because you were out of town traveling and preaching 8 out of the 9 last days.
Yeah. I tell people like a pastor goes in and Like I was asked one time, they said, well, this is what we typically pay a pastor, And, the amount, and keep in mind, the amount was a flat thing. There was no taxes held out, nothing.
Right.
And they said, can you live on that? And I said, can you live on that? And they're like, no. And I said, okay, then why are you asking me that, Well, at the same thing, it's like somebody supports a missionary. We get it in our mind that they've got to be doing something 24/7 while we're sitting over here not doing it. But because we're supporting, I would tell anybody that's supporting you, I'd tell them this, that you have to believe in what God has called you to do. If you're partnering with that, and here's the thing, just as much as those people, especially guys that are ministers, pastors and such, they know that, man, you've got to have a break. You've got to, even Jesus would withdraw. Now the multitudes came, and interrupted, but the thing of it is, you left the pastorate at Lee Creek to do this kind of church revitalization. But in that, God is leading you to do a lot of other things.
Right.
And you don't know what's going to come out of it. So, these times that you're not in a church, the people just need to believe that what God's doing is His will. So.
I think that's a good point. And I'm like I said, I would rather go get in a fight. I don't want downtime.
Right.
I've got to learn, okay, you're not getting the Friday off like you used to get every week, and I'm not saying pastors have it better. There were times I went 3 weeks without a day off in a pastorate.
Right.
But it's harder to schedule when you travel. It's harder to schedule when you don't know where you're going to be, or you're interim in a church that's an hour away. You're driving 2 hours every time you go there. It's just, you've got to learn. It's not wrong to take time off, whether you take it in a week lump. And I never really turn my phone off and say, all right, you can't talk to me right now. I still work, I was going to take off Friday, and now I was going to take off Thursday. And dude, 7:30, my phone rang. I was on the phone for 45 minutes with a pastor. I hung up. I started making coffee. I started scrambling some eggs. My phone rang. I was 50 minutes with another pastor talking. And look, I love doing that. It's what I'm here for. And so anyways, rolled around 10 o'clock. I was on my third phone call, and I was like, I don't think today's the day you're going to take off. You've already wasted.
You done blew that.
Yeah, you've already wasted. So I just went back to work. But anyways, well, man, I hate to knock it off, but
yeah, we got some folks in here.
A special guest just walked in.
She looks familiar.
Yeah.
Who is it?
That's my mother.
Is that I've got to meet her.
Yeah, I figured you'd probably want to talk.
I do want to talk.
My mom and dad came in. I don't know. I don't think they've ever been to the bookstore when it's been open.
Oh, I've got to meet these people.
Yeah, they hadn't been here in a year. So since we opened up last May, so we're coming right at a year. And I don't know what they stopped by for, just to talk, I guess. But anyways,
they might like you. They probably like your wife.
There were some people in here getting books earlier, and we just went right through them. But my parents are probably here to talk to me, so we probably ought to wrap it up. Any last thoughts before we wrap it up?
Nope, I've enjoyed it.
I did too. I thought we'd go 2 hours, but
we could have, but we didn't. We got folks.
We needed to talk about G3 and their.
Well, maybe before I get it back home, we'll do that.
We can always turn it back on after my parents leave and talk about G3 and their funding. So
yeah.
All right, let's get off here, Ronnie.
All right.
Thanks for listening, folks. We'll catch you on the next Backwoods Baptist podcast.